As Herbert watched the monster awaken, he immediately ordered his men to flee. Without hesitation, he bolted, shouting for the others to run if they could. Cannon and Jin tried to stop him, but Acreon blocked their path. Cannon couldn't believe Herbert had stooped to something even worse. Shortly after, Hien reported they had managed to capture half of the envoys. Determined, Jin made up his mind to catch Herbert himself and asked Cannon to deal with Acreon. Cannon assured him they'd catch up soon. Acreon lunged at Jin, but Jin effortlessly deflected the attack. As Jin pursued Herbert, Cannon and his team took charge of the remaining envoys. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Cannon unleashed his wind magic on Acreon. The massive creature crashed to the ground, allowing Cannon's teammates to step in and confront it. Thanks to the protective charm Jin had left behind, Cannon was undaunted by the monster's counterattacks. He pushed the beast back while Hien and the others followed up with their own assaults. The envoys finally understood why it was so difficult to escape their pursuers. Just then, Acreon's offspring began to surround them. Cannon's teammates moved quickly to save the envoys while cursing Herbert, calling him a reckless leader. They revealed they were nothing more than pawns to Herbert, who had even sacrificed one of them to awaken Acreon's variant. Meanwhile, Hien relentlessly attacked Acreon with various techniques, dealing significant damage. Desperate, the wounded Acreon tried to escape toward the lava pool, letting out a powerful roar, a signal to summon its much larger companion. In response, both monsters unleashed fire breath and streams of molten lava, launching a fierce assault. Cannon's teammates got caught in some flames and jokingly called it a rookie mistake. Cannon quickly instructed them to lure the monsters out of the lava pool. As they retreated, the monsters followed in pursuit. While on the run, Hien used his healing gloves to tend to the others. Realizing that fighting both monsters in the lava would be a huge disadvantage, the group decided to focus all their efforts on the first monster to separate them. They halted their retreat and launched a counterattack. Despite the monsters still standing tall, everyone gave it their all. Meanwhile, Jin was still chasing after Herbert. The villain grew increasingly frustrated as Jin showed no signs of fatigue despite the long pursuit. Desperate, Herbert ordered his remaining men to slow Jin down, but Jin easily took them out, starting with the swordsman. A mage attempted to cast a spell, but Jin swiftly incapacitated him. At last, it was just Jin and Herbert. Jin confronted him, expressing his disgust at Herbert's willingness to sacrifice others to save himself. Herbert reminded Jin of someone awful from his past. In rage, Herbert accused Jin of being unreasonable and attacked with his spear. Jin, unfazed, flung a water ball to the side. Herbert laughed, thinking Jin had missed, but Jin's real target was the lava pool. Steam quickly filled the area, blinding Herbert. He spotted a silhouette and lunged, only to realize it was a decoy. Jin had been behind him the whole time. "It's over, Herbert," Jin declared, using a water cyclone to send Herbert flying. Herbert crashed to the ground, severely injured. At that moment, Cannon and the others arrived. Cannon noticed a pile of sludge nearby, and Jin explained it was part of his distraction. Despite his pain, Herbert continued to curse at Jin. Cannon, in response, ordered his Emperor Slime to drop onto Herbert. The slime enveloped him, burning through his skin and clothes. Watching Herbert squirm, Jin asked Cannon if he was trying to kill him. Cannon casually replied that he was merely immobilizing Herbert. Though he admitted Herbert might lose most of his skin, he wouldn't die. He planned to take Herbert back, treating him as a trophy, calling him less than human. Jin then remembered Cannon's infamous nickname, the Little Demon. Jin suggested using his golem to transport the captives and decided to put Herbert's problems aside for now. He wondered aloud if Esther and Dan had made it to Rosaria for the battle. On the other hand, Esther was struggling to believe she'd ever return to her homeland. As soon as Dan and Esther, along with the Hughes brothers, joined Count Brand's main forces, the Count welcomed his son and the group back. Without delay, he briefed them on their next mission, to reclaim Killed, which had fallen under Nazel's control. Esther took in the grim news, realizing that even more of Rosardov's land had been lost. Tar, Rosardov's capital, was now mostly under Ku's control, save for a few pockets of resistance that were on the verge of collapse. Rosara had turned into a battlefield between Ku and Maisel. The prince had also heard about Jin training both his son and the other children. The Hughes brothers reassured the count that they were ready for battle, fit, and prepared. Hearing this, the nobleman sternly reminded his son and the others that they were at war. He warned them not to see their enemies as humans. Unlike monsters, their foes could speak, had families, but in war, it didn't matter. They had to kill as many as they could. Even trained soldiers hesitated to kill, sometimes losing their sanity in the process. He made it clear that if the burden was too heavy, he would send them home. Esther, however, reassured him, expressing gratitude for his concern. With a bit of free time, Esther took a walk around the camp. She overheard soldiers praising Dan for his fame as an adventurer, the Hughes brothers for their impressive magical talents, and Chris for being a commanding presence as the young heir of House Bran. However, they doubted Esther's capabilities despite her being the sibling of an S-ranked adventurer. They assumed she wouldn't be able to prove herself on the battlefield, dismissing her as a fragile girl who couldn't handle the fight. Dan, overhearing their conversation, confronted the soldiers. Flustered, they quickly came up with excuses and scattered. Esther apologized to Dan for the trouble, but Dan told her not to let their words get to her. Esther admitted that she had grown used to people gossiping behind her back. Ever since Q took over Rosara, rumors had started swirling about her and Jin. Whispers claimed that the siblings had lined their pockets and fled just before the kingdom fell. Dan reassured her, saying she was better than those soldiers and suggested they should be taught a lesson. Esther agreed but was cautious, not wanting to cause a scene that might damage her brother's reputation. Dan, feeling uneasy, promised to step in if things got out of hand. But Esther declined, determined to show her fighting skills to silence the doubters. Dan agreed and suggested they meet with Count Bran that very night. Later, the two met with Count Bran, who wanted to discuss something important. He proposed that Esther join his personal guard to gain confidence and experience. He based this on Jin's stories about her achievements and strength. Although he considered making her a platoon commander, he knew some soldiers wouldn't accept it. The Count believed this was a safer way for her to prove herself. Dan then asked if Count Bran was aware of the negative talk about Esther among his soldiers. The Count acknowledged it, admitting he had punished those who went too far, but it only worsened the situation. He feared more punishment would lower the morale of his troops. Esther felt a bit of sympathy, but the Count blamed himself as their leader for the situation. After some thought, Esther made a bold request. She wanted to fight on the front lines. The Count hesitated, concerned for her safety, but Esther confidently assured him that her brother had trained her well. She believed the rumors would stop once she demonstrated her skill with a spear. The Count worried Jin would be furious if something happened to her, but Dan vouched for her, promising to keep a close eye on Esther and ensure she didn't overextend herself. He also mentioned that there were no well-known soldiers on Nazel's side. Finally, the Count agreed to let Esther join the front lines but warned her to fall back if things became too dangerous. Esther beamed with excitement and thanked the Count. In the days before Esther and the others joined the Brand Company, Gordon Nonlin was exhausted, locked in battle against enemy forces. It had been 6 months since he became a slave soldier. The capital was under siege, and his worn-out spear was useless against the onslaught. His thoughts drifted to Esther, wondering if she was safe. He had heard that she followed Jin to Q as a slave and feared for her well-being. He knew how close the two were and questioned if Jin had treated her poorly. Just then, a heavily armored knight appeared from Nazel's ranks, cutting down soldiers like they were nothing. A Rosara commander ordered his troops to face the knight, and, recalling Gordon's talent with a spear, sent him into battle. But Gordon and the others knew they were hopelessly outmatched with their inferior weapons and gear. Gordon fought with no hope, secretly wishing for death. As he swung his spear, his mind wandered back to his life, always controlled by his overbearing father, and now facing death as a slave. His only remaining family, his daughter, had chosen to follow Jin, despite them not being blood relatives. He knew Esther would never forgive him. At that moment, Gordon took a fatal blow. He wished he could apologize to his daughter if they ever met in the afterlife. Meanwhile, Count Bran and his forces had begun surrounding the capital. His soldiers started scaling the walls while Esther and Dan advanced. Arrows rained down, but Dan cast a shield of wind to deflect them. The prince's army began battering the city gates. Esther and Dan continued climbing. Using her magic, Esther summoned a whirlwind that tore through the soldiers ahead. Once on the walls, she wielded her spear with deadly precision, cutting down enemies like they were nothing. Her wind shield blocked incoming arrows, making her a formidable force. Dan caught up to Esther, teasing her to leave some enemies for him. He charged into the fray, cursing at the enemy soldiers as he cut them down. Count Bran's troops were in awe, watching the petite Esther dispatching enemies with such ease. Inspired, they joined her and Dan on the front lines. The battering team finally broke through the gates, and the Count's forces flooded the city. After the wall was secured, Dan checked on Esther, who was unharmed. She had been healing herself as she fought, using her magic to stay in top shape. Dan called over some soldiers and asked if they had seen Esther's performance. Humbled, they apologized for mocking her and thanked her, saying fewer of their men had died thanks to her and Dan. Dan, satisfied that the rumors were dying down, reminded Esther they still had to help finish securing the city, and only then could they relax. In the heart of the city, Esther split from Dan, cutting down every enemy in her path. She eventually reached the town square, passing through a narrow alley when she heard a soldier's desperate shout, telling a monster to stay back. Rounding the corner, Esther's heart sank. There stood her father, Gordon, now a lifeless zombie. A cold sweat broke out across her skin as she stared at him in disbelief. The most formidable weapon Nasal wielded was their dark necromancy. Their soldiers, once resurrected, felt no pain or exhaustion. It was a chilling sight, one that broke the spirits of the living. But nothing was more horrific than facing someone who had once been family. Esther could hardly believe the cruel irony of being reunited with her father in this twisted way. Then, to her shock, Gordon, now a zombie, called out to her by name. He still had his mind, even in his undead form. Gordon began apologizing, admitting how he had failed as a father. Before Esther could even react, a familiar voice interrupted, telling Gordon to stop his apologies. From the shadows emerged a skeletal figure who addressed Esther as his granddaughter. Her shock deepened as she realized this undead creature was her grandfather. Gordon, still concerned for his daughter, asked if Jinn had mistreated her, vowing to remain a monster to protect her. But her grandfather, unimpressed, mocked Gordon's weakness, suggesting instead that he possess a newly born noble before their soul could escape the world, as it would offer more power. As the two undead figures argued in front of her, Esther had enough. She declared that she hadn't forgiven either of them and never would, but in exchange for raising her, she offered them one final mercy, a proper send-off. With a fierce incantation, Esther unleashed a blaze of fire, reducing Gordon to ashes. Her grandfather, startled by her sudden attack, barely had time to react before Esther lunged at him with her spear. He attempted to scold her for being ungrateful, but she silenced him by shattering his skull with a swift strike. After the messy reunion, Esther knew there was something more. A necromancer had to be nearby, controlling the risen dead. She focused her senses and soon heard a voice complaining about losing control of Gordon and her father. Spotting a few guards among the enemies, Esther called for reinforcements. The necromancer, sensing the danger, frantically attempted to raise the nearby corpses as undead soldiers, though none were strong enough to match Esther. Just then, Esther's team launched a surprise attack. With a powerful gust of wind, she sent their enemies flying. As the enemy forces were paralyzed, her allies surged forward. The necromancer, now wounded and desperate, cursed Esther as he crawled away. She didn't let him get far without hesitation. She drove her spear through his throat, silencing him for good. As the necromancer fell lifeless, Esther raised her spear high and declared her victory. Her comrades erupted in cheers, celebrating their hard-won triumph together. Meanwhile, Jinn paid a visit to Loop, the leader of the Elder Tree clan. He presented Luke with a gift as a token of gratitude for volunteering to spar against Na and Yin during their rank advancement tests. Luke acknowledged the strength of both fighters. Jin apologized for approaching him right after his return from the labyrinth, but Luke assured him it was no problem. Ever since the purgatory and emissary monopolies were broken, his clan could freely navigate the labyrinths. It had been a chaotic ordeal, but Luke thanked Jin for making Exile a safer place. He then mentioned that Elder Tree had become the top clan now, with only Jin's Regalia clan standing as their equal. At that moment, Luke proposed an alliance between their two clans as he had no intention of being enemies with Jin. He hoped they could foster a positive relationship moving forward. Jin agreed, noting that neither of them needed to tear each other down like the larger clans often did. Luke brought up that some of his affiliates had gotten involved in the ongoing war. If things went wrong, he would need a stable position to fall back on. Jin quickly agreed to formalize their alliance, even suggesting a gathering to celebrate both clans joining forces. A few days later, Qual's forces conquered the capital of the Tar Kingdom. King Rosarin and his nobles were swiftly sentenced to death. Through a magical artifact called the Tele-Image, Jin and the others watched the horrific execution. The king and his court were boiled alive in a massive cauldron, with the king's final words being a curse directed at his son, Jin. Despite witnessing the death of his biological father, Jin felt nothing. With that, the Rosardo kingdom ceased to exist, and Jin felt a strange sense of relief. Now, his only concern was for Esther and the others. Afterward, Duke Funker approached Jin and informed him that the sea had finally opened to Qual's control, leaving only Nazel's forces to be dealt with. Jin quickly realized that Qual's primary goal had always been to secure the sea routes. Initially, they had relied on the Yamato for essential supplies like salt, but now that Qual controlled Rosart's coastal regions, they could trade with distant lands and build a formidable navy. Funker also mentioned that the king of Qual wanted Jin to claim the throne of Rosa, but Jin refused. After the war, Crown Princess Nenda had assumed the title of Arda's ruler, leading her forces on the battlefield. Jin's only request was that he be allowed to keep the land where the Rosa Labyrinth stood. Funker advised Jin to demand more, but Jin didn't want to stir up any unnecessary trouble. Funker then asked Jin what his plans were going forward. Jin responded that his next priority was to hire more people, preparing for whatever came next. Shortly after, Jin took a fairy under his wing. The servants found her adorable and asked who she was. Jin introduced her as Marina, a new party member he found in the market, once sold as a slave. She had exceptional magic skills, particularly in summoning. Jin had employed the other staff for security and household management, as he needed people to run Clan Regalia smoothly. He asked Urza to train the servants, reminding him they would soon receive Qual citizenship. Grateful, Urza promised to always support Jin. Marina, fluttering around, asked Jin if he was sure about not confining her. Jin reassured her, saying she could go anywhere she liked as long as he knew where she was. Confused? Nah, and the servants listened as Jin explained that Marina's previous owner, a Gale noble, kept her locked in a cage like an insect. The noble, known for his temper, would beat his slaves, except Marina, because fairies were too valuable. Yet, when in a foul mood, he'd deny her food. Desperate for money, the noble eventually sold Marina. When not asked about Marina's parents, the fairy said she could no longer remember them as they had passed away. Touched, Na hugged Marina, promising to treat her like a sister. Although Jin seemed concerned, he ultimately decided to entrust Marina to Na's care for a while. Jin then turned to Ian, instructing him to look after the younger members and train them as security personnel. He also mentioned the upcoming alliance party with Elder Tree. Suddenly, Jin felt a strange unease, wondering what was behind the unsettling feeling creeping over him.